Hey everyone, it's Triple Mango Threat, and today we're talking about the two color commanders you should be playing. Let's jump right into it. So first up, we're talking about Reese the Redeemed, and this can be cast for a white or a green. It's a 1/1 elf warrior that has two cool abilities. We can pay 2, a green or a white, tap it, put a 1/1 green and white elf warrior creature token into play. Or we can pay 4 and Selesnya twice, tap it, and for each creature token we control, we can put a token into play that's a copy of that creature. So this commander is really going to be promoting tokens, and only for 1 mana, this is a great commander. So we can make a lot of tokens with cards like Scoot Swarm. Whenever a land enters our battlefield, we can actually make a 1/1 green insect creature token, and if we control more than 6 lands, we're actually going to be making copies of Scoot Swarm, so we can end up making even more copies with our commander. And also with Imperious Perfect, this is promoting Elf Tribal because it's giving our elves +1/+1, and we can also pay a green and tap it to create a 1/1 green elf warrior creature token. This doesn't have to be an Elf Tribal, but just by paying 1 green and making a token, this is a great way to make even more tokens with our commander. And since we're having a lot of creatures enter our battlefield, I recommend cards like Cathar's Crusade. Whenever a creature enters our battlefield, we can put a +1/+1 counter on each of our creatures. So even just paying that 1 green and tapping Imperious Perfect and making that elf token, all of our creatures are getting +1/+1. And whenever those tiny tokens come into play, we can actually draw cards off of that with Mentor of the Meek. Whenever a creature with power 2 or less enters our battlefield, we can pay 1 mana to draw a card. Or we can draw even more cards with Skull Clamp. We can pay 1 to equip it to a creature, usually with toughness 1, so that means it instantly dies. We even have a board wipe that's really in our favor. We have Hour of Reckoning. It is 7 mana, but we can also make it a lot cheaper by tapping our creatures and reducing even the white symbols in this card. We can destroy all non-token creatures. Now this is a very token focused deck, so this is a great board wipe for us. If we're looking to end the game, we have cards like Mere Entity or even Craterhoof Behemoth. This is going to make our creatures huge either by us paying mana to increase their power and toughness, or when Craterhoof enters the battlefield, all of our creatures are going to gain trample and +X/+X, where X is the number of creatures we control, and since we're going to have a huge amount of creatures, we can easily end the game with this. And the last card I want to mention for this commander is Seedborn Muse. We can untap all permanents we control during each other player's untap step. This is a super powerful card, especially for only 5 mana. So this means every turn, if we have an additional 6 mana to untap with our commander, we're making a huge amount of tokens, not just on our turn, but every single player's turn. The next commander we're talking about is Brigitte the Demagogue. For 1 white and black, we have a 1/3 bird warlock. Brigitte has flying, and also whenever a player attacks one of your opponents, if that opponent has more life than another of your opponents, that attacking player draws a card and you put 2 +1/+1 counters on a creature you control. Now this may seem a little confusing, but to break it down, whenever a player attacks an opponent and doesn't have the lowest life, they're going to be drawing a card and we get to put 2 +1/+1 counters on a creature we control. And what's really sweet is that it says a player, so this means whenever we attack an opponent that doesn't have the lowest life, we're drawing a card and we're still getting those counters. We have multiple creatures and we're attacking multiple opponents. There's a possibility we're drawing 2 or 3 cards off of our commander and getting 6 +1/+1 counters. But more than likely it's going to be 2 cards and 4 +1/+1 counters. So really this deck is all about encouraging our opponents to hit each other. So we can have cards like Hunted Lamassu. Whenever it enters the battlefield, target opponent creates a 4/4 black horror creature token. Well, this card is actually a 5/5 flyer, so it's very likely they're not going to swing at us, but hopefully at our opponents. We also have Curse of Disturbance. Whenever the enchanted player is attacked, we're going to create a 2/2 black zombie, and each opponent that attacks that player does the same. We can also goad our opponent's creatures with cards like Bloodthirsty Blade, so now they have to attack if they're able, and that creature even gets +2/+0. We can also become the Monarch, which will increase the likelihood that somebody would attack us, but having Monarch in Commander is a lot of fun because that's giving everybody the possibility of drawing a card, players are swinging at each other, so a lot's happening. So we can become the Monarch with cards like Archon of Coronation, Court of Ambition, Court of Grace, or even Marchesa's Decree. What's really cool about Marchesa's Decree is that whenever a creature attacks us or a planeswalker we control, that creature's controller is going to lose 1 life, so again, this is deterring our opponents from swinging at us and hopefully swinging at our opponents. We can also promote this with cards like Scheming Symmetry. This is a 1 black mana tutor at sorcery speed. We're going to choose 2 target players, and each of them are going to search their library for a card, then they're going to shuffle their library and put that card on top of it. We can make a lot of deals with this card. There's also Ink Shield. We can prevent all combat damage that would be dealt to us, and for each 1 damage we prevented, we can actually make a 2/1 white and black Inkling with flying, which is going to help us hopefully be able to kill our opponents the very next turn, because if someone tries to deal us 20 damage, well, we're going to have 40 damage on the board after that, just for 5 mana. And then finally, the last card I want to talk about is Shadric's Silverquill. This is going to make it where at the beginning of our combat on our turn, we can choose 2 of these modes, and each mode must target a different player. So we can help someone draw a card, we can help a player get a 2/1 white and black Inkling, or we can even put a +1/+1 counter on each creature that player controls. So we're making a lot of deals with this deck, so if you love politics, this is a great one for you. The next commander we're talking about is Edric, Spymaster of Trest. For 1 green/blue, it's a 2/2 elf rogue. Whenever a creature deals combat damage to one of your opponents, its controller may draw a card. What's really sweet about this commander is that we can be drawing cards off of our creatures, especially if they're unblockable. So we have cards like Triton Shorestalker, Slitherblade, and Tetsuko Umezawa Fugitive. This makes it where if our creatures have power or toughness 1 or less, they can't be blocked, which again is going to help us draw even more cards because we're dealing our opponents combat damage. But remember, this is also encouraging our opponents to hit each other because they can draw cards whenever their creatures deal combat damage to an opponent, and as long as it's not us, because we are not an opponent to ourselves. So this could be sort of a group hug deck by encouraging a no max hand size. So we have Folio of Fancies. We can make a lot of players draw a huge amount of cards. We can also make them mill because they have a huge amount of cards in their hands as well. Or if we're just wanting to help ourselves, we have Spellbook. This is a 0 mana artifact that makes us have no max hand size. We can also end the game with cards like Beastmaster Ascension and Biomass Mutation. We can pay X to make our creatures power and toughness XX until end of turn. Or with Beastmaster Ascension, if we attack with 7 or more creatures, in just 1 turn they get +5/+5, but even over time, if this has 7 or more quest counters on it, our creatures get +5/+5, but I wouldn't recommend that because this could be easily removed when it comes time to put that 7th counter on it. Our opponents can just remove it, so be sure not to give your opponents information that could cost us the game. Selvala Explorer Return. For 1 white/green, it's a 2/4 elf scout with Parlay. We can tap it, and each player is going to reveal the top card of their library. For each non-land card revealed this way, we're going to add a green mana to our mana pool and gain 1 life. Then each player draws a card. When I build this commander, I want to be able to untap Selvala as many times as I can. So we have cards like Umbral Mantle, 1000-Year Elixir, Sword of the Perunes, Quirion Ranger, the list goes on. Being able to untap our commander is very powerful, and we're going to be drawing a lot of cards and gaining a lot of life. So this can be a group hug deck as well. We can have Temple Bell to make each player draw a card. Howling Mine, each player is going to draw an additional card at their draw step. Horn of Greed, whenever they play a land, that player gets to draw a card. Gear Per Ori is going to allow them to play an additional land, and if they don't have any cards at their upkeep, they get to draw 3 and then draw their normal card for turn. Font of Mythos is like a Howling Mine ×2. We pay 4 mana, and then each player draws 2 cards in addition to their draw step. But we can gain the most benefit from cards like Alhammar's Archive. Whenever we gain life, we gain twice as much. Whenever we draw a card, except the first one we draw in each of your draw steps, draw 2 instead. So every time we're activating Selvala and we get that non-land card, we get to draw 2 cards. So Selvala can end up getting us 8 cards if everybody has a non-land card on top of their library. And that means 8 life as well. And so again, I recommend cards like Seedborn Muse. That way we can activate this more than just once in 1 turn. This is on every player's untap step. We're going to be able to untap all of our permanents. So that means our commander, so we get another parlay trigger on someone else's turn. The next commander we're talking about is Svella Ice Shaper. For 1 red/green, we have a 2/4 Troll Warrior. We can pay 3 and tap our commander to create a colorless snow artifact token named Icy Manolith, and that card has tap, add 1 mana of any color. Or we can also pay 6 red/green, tap our commander. We can look at the top 4 cards of our library. We can cast a spell from among them without paying its mana cost, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Now this is a very powerful ability because it's very likely the top 4 cards are going to be more than just 8 mana. So we can do silly things like Apex Devastator. This is a 10 mana spell that has Cascade, 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 Cascade. So that means even more spells off of our commander. We can even cast things like Savage Ventmaw. When it attacks, we can add 6 mana to our mana pool, and we don't lose it until end of turn. We can even repeat our commander's awesome ability with cards like Rings of Bright Hearth and Illusionist Bracers. This will get really dumb, so this can be the top 8 cards instead of the top 4. We can also cast things like Galta Primal Hunger. It's a 12/12 with trample that normally gets a really great reduction off of the total power of creatures we control. So instead of 12 mana, we're just paying 8 if this is in our top 4. We can also have cards like Blightsteel Colossus, where it has trample, infect, and it's indestructible, and it's an 11/11, so when it deals combat damage to an opponent, they're going to die if they take 10 infect. And so you probably guessed it, our commander is really good with Seedborn Muse. Again, we're untapping all of our permanents, so now our commander is able to be used again. So we get this sweet ability, and even fighting some not so good cards in our top 4, which are actually really good because we're not paying their mana cost, we can draw cards off of cards like Harmonize and Return of the Wild Speaker. Harmonize is going to get us 3 cards, and Return of the Wild Speaker lets us draw cards to the greatest power among non-human creatures we control, which our commander is 2 power, but again, we could be casting this for free and drawing 2 cards, or if we have one of the huge creatures we cast from our commander from earlier, we can end up drawing a lot of cards off of this. So if you love having a random commander casting really awesome things from your library, this is a great deck for you. The next commander we're talking about is Brau, King Eternal for 2 white-blue. It's a 2/4 Spirit Noble with flying. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, we're going to exile any number of target non-land permanents we control, and then we're going to return those cards to the battlefield under their owner's control. So some players may have cards like Muldrifter, which is going to let them draw 2 cards every time their commander deals combat damage. Or they may have Core Cartographer. When it enters the battlefield, we get a plains onto the battlefield tapped. But there are some really mean cards with cards like Stonehorn Dignitary. We can have an opponent skip their next combat phase. Or we can start having our opponents sacrifice their stuff with Reality Acid. Normally this is going to enchant a permanent for 3 mana, and then it has Vanishing 3, so when this enters the battlefield it has 3 time counters on it. At the beginning of our upkeep we're going to remove a counter from it, and when the last one is removed we have to sacrifice it. And whenever Reality Acid leaves the battlefield, the enchanted permanent's controller sacrifices it. So instead of waiting 3 turns, whenever our commander deals combat damage, we can actually exile this, put it onto something else of our opponents, and they're going to have to sacrifice that the next time we get to blink it. So this gets really mean. Also with Nevermaker, when it leaves play, we can put target non-land permanent on top of its owner's library. So we can start putting silly things on top of our opponent's library, and they will have to keep drawing it every single turn, and that's going to get very annoying. Like if they're not looking to draw their Llanowar Elves every single turn, try to cast it, we're going to put it back on top of their library, it gets very annoying. But our commander also works with mana rocks, so we have Basalt Monolith. Normally we have to pay 3 to untap it, but with our commander we can actually have it enter the battlefield, it's not going to be tapped, and then we just have 3 mana in our second main phase for free. So since there's a lot of ETBs in the deck, I really recommend Panharmonicon. This says if an artifact or a creature entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. So this means when Muldrifter enters the battlefield, we're drawing 4 cards. Or when Stonehorn Dignitary is going to enter the battlefield, we can choose 2 opponents to skip their combat phase. And the same with all the other cards. Doubling the ETBs is an insane thing to do. The next commander we're talking about is Brian Stout Arm for 2 red-white is a 4/4 giant warrior with lifelink. We can pay a red and tap it, sacrifice another creature, and our commander deals damage equal to the sacrificed creature's power to target player. What's really important is that our commander's dealing damage, so we're actually gaining life whenever we use Brian's ability. Now normally some players are like, okay, so I'm going to be casting huge creatures and then sacrificing them to deal damage to my opponents. Well actually, we can start gaining control of our opponent's creatures with cards like Act of Treason. We'll gain control of one of their creatures, we can untap it, and it will gain haste until end of turn, so we can actually attack with it, and if they decide to block it, we can actually in response sacrifice it to our commander and end up dealing them damage anyways. And so whenever their creatures die, we can actually tap cards like a Darker Valkyrie. When target creature other than a Darker Valkyrie is put into a graveyard this turn, return that card to play under your control. So we're constantly getting those cards back whenever they die. There's also Calamity Bearer. If a giant source you control would deal damage to a permanent or player, it doubles that damage to that permanent or player instead. So instead of us dealing, let's say, 4 damage with our commander's ability, it's actually going to be 8. And that can be a lot of damage very quickly. Hamlet Back Goliath is a really easy way to start killing our opponents, because when another creature enters the battlefield, so not just ours, but our opponents as well, we're going to put that many +1/+1 counters on this creature, where X is that creature's power. We also have Luminous Broodmoth. Whenever a creature we control without flying dies, we're going to return it to the battlefield under its owner's control with a flying counter on it. So when our creatures die, we're getting them right back, and now they have flying in addition to whatever they had. So again, more ways to sacrifice and deal damage to our opponents. There's also Sigil of the New Dawn. Whenever a creature is put into our graveyard from the battlefield, we can actually pay 1 and a white to return it back to our hand. We still have to cast it, but this is very helpful because in red and white, there's not a lot of ways to bring our creatures from the graveyard back to the battlefield or even to our hand. Same thing with Angelic Renewal. When a creature is put into our graveyard from the battlefield, we can actually sacrifice this card and then return that card to the battlefield, only for 2 mana. And finally, if we're not killing our opponents with our commander, we can also win the game with cards like Felidar Sovereign. At the beginning of our upkeep, if we have 40 or more life, we're going to win the game. And this is very likely because we're gaining life off of our commander just because he has lifelink. Next, we're talking about Raph Capuchin, Chip's Mage, for 2 white and blue. It's a 3/3 human wizard, flash, flying, and you may cast historic spells as though they had flash. Now, historic spells are artifacts, legendaries, and sagas. So this means Raph's going to give us the capability of Vidalcan Orrery, which is a $30 card if we specify our deck down to artifacts, legendaries, and sagas. And there's some really cool historic cards that we can cast at instant speed. For example, we have Urza's Ruinous Blast. This is a 5 mana legendary sorcery, so this counts as a historic spell. We can exile all non-land permanents that aren't legendary, so this can really hurt our opponents if they don't have Legendary Tribal. We also have Karn's Temporal Sundering. This is a legendary sorcery. Target player gets to take an extra turn after this one. We can return up to one target non-land permanent to its owner's hand, and then we're going to exile this card. We can also make our spells cheaper with cards like Joyous Familiar. Historic spells are going to cost us one less. But if we go a little bit deeper into the artifact side of things, we can start making our artifacts one less with cards like Foundry Inspector, or even Ethereum Sculptor. Only for 2 or 3 mana, we can start reducing the cost of our artifacts. We also have some legendary creatures in the deck like Baird Steward of Argive. This gives us the Ghostly Prison effect, except it's only 1 mana. Or we have Arcanus the Omnipotent. It's a legendary creature where we tap it and draw 3 cards. We also have Wavebreak Hippocamp. Now this isn't a historic spell, but it's going to give us the ability to start drawing cards whenever we're casting spells that aren't on our turn. And the same with Naid of Hiven Coves. As long as it's not our turn, spells are going to cost us 1 less to cast. The next commander we're talking about is Rakdos Lord of Riots. For black, red, we have a 6/6 demon. You can't cast Rakdos Lord of Riots unless an opponent lost life this turn. Rakdos has Flying and Trample, and creature spells are going to cost us 1 less for each 1 life your opponent's lost this turn. So we'll need cards that help our opponents lose life, and we don't actually have to deal them combat damage. We have cards like Thermal Alchemist, Stormfist Crusader, Spear Spewer, and Nettle Drone. We can actually tap these creatures or have our opponents draw an additional card and lose a life, and that way we can actually be able to start casting our commander or having our creature spells cost 1 less. But remember, this is for each 1 life our opponents have lost. So if we deal them 4 damage 1 turn, that means our creature spells cost 4 colorless less. So this commander can be very popular with Eldrazi. So there will be cards like Artisan of Kozilek, Desolation Twin, and Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger. Really just enter any Eldrazi card and it's going to be really good for this deck because you're going to be able to cast it for free. Or even artifact creatures like Burnished Heart and Meteor Golem. Or we can just reduce the cost of just normal creatures like Bloodgift Demon and Heartless Hitsugu, which is actually pretty much just going to make any of our colorless creatures for free. We're just going to drop them from our hand onto the battlefield because Heartless Hitsugu deals a lot of damage to each player. We're going to cut their life total in half, rounded down. So let's say we're all at 40 life, now we're at 20. That is 60 life our opponents have lost total, so that means we're just dropping Eldrazi or whatever creatures from our hand onto the battlefield. And with Bloodgift Demon, if we need to draw the card, we can use that ability, or if we want to have our opponents lose a life, they can also draw a card, and then we could be able to cast our commander or even have our creature spells cost 1 less. And finally, the last commander we're talking about is Teysa Karloff. For 2 white-black, it's a 2/4 human advisor. If a creature dying causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. Teysa also has creature tokens you control have vigilance and lifelink. So this can really be seen as an aristocrat deck. A lot of our creatures die, and when they do, we get a lot of benefit from that. Whenever Pawn of Ulamog or another non-token creature we control dies, we normally make a 0/1 Eldrazi spawn. But with our commander, we're making 2 of them, so this is 2 mana we get off of our non-token creatures dying. We also have Pitiless Plunderer. Whenever another creature you control dies, we normally create a treasure token, but now we're getting 2 whenever one of our creatures die. We can also start dealing a lot of damage with cards like Zulaport Cutthroat and Blood Artist. These are really important because they have the word dies in it. So Zulaport Cutthroat is focused on whenever one of our creatures die, we're dealing 1 damage to each one of our opponents and we gain 1 life. Blood Artist, whenever a creature dies, so ours or our opponents, we get to have one opponent lose 1 life and we gain 1 life. And if we have our commander, that's going to be target opponent losing 2 life and we're gaining 2. We're also drawing cards off of Grim Hauerspex and Harvester of Souls. Whenever a non-token creature dies, whether it's ours from Grim Hauerspex or even any creature off of Harvester of Souls, we're drawing cards, and that means 2 cards when we have our commander. A really easy card to sacrifice is Reassembling Skeleton. This costs 1 and a black for a 1/1 skeleton warrior, and it has this ability where if we pay 1 and a black, we can return it to the battlefield tapped. So if we don't have anything else to sacrifice, this is always available for us to sacrifice, and we're going to get a huge amount of triggers from our commander off of this. We even have Doom Traveler from 1 white. It's a 1/1 human soldier. Whenever it dies, we're going to create a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying. And with our commander, that means 2 spirits. Finally, I want to talk about Ogre Slumlord. Whenever another non-token creature dies, so this means any creature, we can create a 1/1 black rat creature token, and our rats have Death Touch. So we're making a huge amount of tokens with this deck, and we can actually start attacking with them with our commander because they're going to have vigilance and lifelink, and again, we can later sacrifice them to get even more triggers off of our commander. Thank you all so much for watching. If you'd like any of these cards, you can use the TCG link down below to purchase them. If you'd like to become a patron, you can see your name at the end of the video, and you'll get an exclusive Ultra Sleeve every month. You can get 5% off your Ultra Sleeve order when you use the code TripleMangoThreat. You can get 10% off your order at BCW when you use the code TMT. Be sure to comment down below what you thought of this video and subscribe for more Mango content. I'll see you all in the next one. Peace.